Perhaps the first question I would like to ask you, Colonel, if I may, and it's a very I'm going to be fairly parochial here and talk about Britain a little bit on the British side of these things. What disappoints me is the British are under the impression from the weight of propaganda that one day President Putin was very bored and he woke up because he was bored and decided perhaps to invade the Ukraine to give him something to do for no reason whatsoever. And that appears to be the view that most people in Great Britain have, because that's the view that they've been fed for the last year. It's a question really of a supine mainstream media. And of course, wars, most wars in the modern era are managed to be run on the basis of propaganda and what the masses believe. And we've seen that in the past, and particularly in 1914. And I would like to come back to 1914 because I've read your the beginning of your book on Mons and Haldane, and perhaps we could elaborate on that a little bit. But really, it's propaganda and mainstream media, which of course is the same, I'm sure, in America. Am I right?
No, I think you've summed it up reasonably well, although fortunately, there are more and more people who are skeptical of what they're hearing in the media right now. And I think that's because we've had a rather disappointing experience with the media in the past. We have been systematically misinformed in the past about various things, and people are beginning to wake up to it. So the so-called support for Ukraine or for aiding it has eroded substantially.
Good. Well, I'm pleased to see that. It's we have yet to experience this winter where we are suffering from green policies. It's going to be a very cold winter. Fuel is extremely expensive now, which of course the propaganda is feeding into people that it's the war in the Ukraine, which it isn't, because green policies came much before this. This isn't something that's blown up in the last 10 months. This has been going by failed green policies, wind turbines, solar panels, getting rid of coal fire, so on and so forth, and treating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. And I think people will, by the halfway through this winter, will be taking a bigger interest in actually why they're freezing and why they can't afford things. And it's not the Ukraine. So I'm hoping that we will see the same phenomenon of people drawing away from this, this sort of blind support for the Ukraine. We have people putting blue and yellow flags up in their garden, people who couldn't point to the Ukraine on the map. People with no idea of military history, no idea of Russian history, no idea, frankly, about anything at all. They haven't had the benefit of a traditional education. And so they're falling for this hook, line and sinker. And of course, this is one of the problems, because we don't have mainstream media defense correspondents, which we used to call them. And I know you were around in the days of, in our leading papers, the Daily Telegraph and the Times of London, we had people like Claire Hollingworth and John Keegan, who was the Sandhurst historian, who could actually analyze things in some depth in the newspapers and get away from this propaganda thing. We don't have people like that now, and it might surprise you to know, and I'm pretty sure it'll be the same in the United States. The London Times, until quite recently, their defense correspondent was a woman called Lucy Fisher. Now, she was very good on handbags. She was excellent on handbags, and nobody would dispute that in latest fashion. And I think one day she went to the Christmas party at the Times of London, and somebody said, I think you'd be good on defense. We're going to put you into defense. And Nick Beale at the BBC, and I've crossed swords with him, he doesn't know the difference between a colour sergeant and an able seaman. And when I crossed this on him, he said, doesn't think that's his role. He thinks his role is just to report what's actually happening, not actually take any depth of what has happened, what's happening now, and what might happen in the future. So we have very low-grade defence correspondents. And if you take out the London Times, the Daily Telegraph and BBC, Lord only knows what you're going to get from the Daily Mail and our tabloid newspapers. So nobody seems to actually be taking much notice of this. And until people get properly informed in these matters, I can't see things changing as fast as we need.
Well, even more deeply concerning to me is the absence of any alternative media, particularly in Europe and in Great Britain. If you have only one source, the so-called official government source, whose narrative is embraced wholeheartedly without question by all of the local media, then how can you possibly know what's really happening? Because the government frequently has no interest in sharing the truth. I've been involved in this sort of thing over the last few years. We are very grateful that Elon Musk has invested in Twitter, but we really need much more than that. We need platforms that have been demonetized and eliminated, that were sources of the truth, that are now no longer available to us. So I hope that in the future we can get some more free speech oriented people with money to help bring back these free speech platforms. Right now, anyone who disagrees with the public narrative, as you know, is immediately cast as a Putin agent or a fascist or some other ridiculous remark. This is extremely unhelpful. And you're right, the people putting up the blue and yellow flags don't know what they're doing. It was a healthier environment in Great Britain when someone would have stood up and said, well, do we have any particular interest in Eastern Ukraine? And of course, in Parliament, you had had dead silence because there was no commercial interest in Eastern Ukraine. I remember, well, I can't remember it, but I remember reading about it. Palmerston, who was brought into Parliament in 1864, because there were a number of hotheads in the Parliament who wanted Britain to join with the Danes in a war against Austria and Prussia. Palmerston, of course, rightly thought that was insane. And he agreed he would come and speak. And he pointed out, you can envision this very easily. He pointed out, oh, yes, we could send 150,000 men or 120,000 men, and there's no doubt that our men would give a good account of themselves. And everyone, of course, said, here, 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 here. He said, but the question is, to what purpose? What would they achieve? How could they possibly prevail against the forces of Austria and Prussia? Nations larger, more populous, with larger armies than we have. Would we really be helping the Danes very much? Or should we instead urge the Danes to do the best they can, but to accept a peace early rather than later? So, we had people like Palmerston, Disraeli, even Gladstone could be rational on occasion. And of course, you've had Campbell Bannerman, who was a wonderful prime minister, who was publicly scorned because he apologized for putting Boer women and children into camps during the Boer War, but he did the right thing. And thankfully, as a result, the Boers in South Africa stood the course with Great Britain during World War I. I just don't see statesmen anywhere in the West today. I'm talking about statesmen, not politicians. Politicians are always in abundance, but statesmen think more clearly. They ask the hard questions. They're not simply there to propagandize for a specific purpose. Now, on our television, we have lots of general officers, retired, who come on and paint the grim picture for the Russians and keep telling everyone Ukraine is winning. In fact, the joke here is that since 24 February, this has been one long march to Ukrainian victory, which of course is absurd. Well, that's because most of these general officers are on the payroll of the defense industries and various think tanks that we privately refer to as advocacy tanks. And most of the so-called think tanks in Washington advocate for more war, more intervention, more conflict that we can involve ourselves in. So I think this is now coming to an end, frankly, because we're just about financially broken. We're talking about a $31 trillion national sovereign debt. That puts us right up there with Great Britain in 1947, when the debt to GDP ratio for Great Britain after World War II was 240%. Largely thanks to us, since Franklin Roosevelt wanted to destroy the British Empire and saw running Britain into debt as a way to do that. So I think this is beginning to come to an end here. And most Americans, frankly, as you point out, don't know where Ukraine is and could care less. Americans are far more concerned about what's happening here. I imagine that will eventually happen where you are. If so, that's a good thing. But it is disturbing that this Western elite, this ruling class that we're dealing with, wants so desperately to involve us in a conflict with a major power like Russia. It's one thing to involve us in these wars of choice, these low-intensity conflicts against enemies that have no means of fighting back. I'm talking about Iraq and Afghanistan. Effectively, in military terms, it's analogous to clubbing baby seals. Well, we're not clubbing baby seals anymore. And the opponent is not incompetent. He's not weak. He's not stupid. And interestingly enough, he also doesn't really want a war with us. He wants to put an end to the threat to his country. And I'm talking about Russia in Ukraine, which we've worked tirelessly over the last 20 years to create and then launch against Russia. I often ask why, and I get confusing responses. Oh, well, they're corrupt. Well, substantial portions of our country are corrupt, and the rest of the world has problems with corruption. Well, they're bad actors. What do you mean they're bad actors? You know, you got on this list of stupid statements. Where do their strategic interests collide with ours? And in most cases, nobody can come up with an intelligent answer. It's a well-financed minority in London, New York City, and Washington that seems very interested in destroying Russia. This has now backfired. Russia is actually stronger today, financially and economically, than it was when the war began. And Russia is going to come out of this event with a much larger, more capable, and more lethal military establishment than it had at the beginning. So everything has backfired and is going to continue to backfire because we can no longer try to impose American or US-led Anglo-American hegemony on the rest of the world. The rest of the world doesn't want it. Frankly speaking, we don't need it, and it's bankrupting us. So all of this is going to collapse. It's going to implode. And the Russia war, again, with Ukraine, is just going to accelerate the process.
Interesting. Yes, of course. And Lord Palmerston's predecessor, it goes back to Lord Castlereagh, of course, where the ethos was, if we're not directly threatened, if British interests aren't directly threatened, it's nothing to do with us. And that should really be, especially post-empire. Great Britain is a regional power, but it's not a global power. What we should be doing is consolidating that and not involving ourselves in anything which doesn't concern us. But we have a problem. I don't know whether you would agree with this. We have a problem where we can't shake off the British ego. What are we doing building aircraft carriers, which we can't actually protect because we don't have the wherewithal, so they can only work with the United States because we can't defend them. We're fighting the last war, and I was looking at your trilogy and what you've written in the last few months, which I am fascinating. It's spooky. I agree with almost everything that you write or say, that we can't seem to just bring ourselves back from this because we're fighting the last war. And of course, in World War II, we had lots and lots of huge battleships, which were turtling, because the Royal Navy wanted battleships which were obsolete for the Second World War. Now we're building aircraft carriers which are obsolete for any future war. And you go back, I don't know whether you've ever looked at the government of, in your historical research of the government of Lord Salisbury, who is fascinating. He was actually a libertarian and a very, very good prime minister in a very, very competent administration. And he said the fascinating is with senior admirals is that they will always prevaricate for years and years and years, and then eventually press the go button on something which by that stage it's out of date or obsolete. And we haven't changed. The British haven't changed a bit. But of course, I suppose if you're an admiral, you really would love the idea of a really huge, great ship with lots of toys. It's boys and toys, isn't it?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, you and we suffer from an acute case of national narcissism. That's a problem. People love to think of themselves as the center of the universe and as this invincible, invulnerable force on the world stage. The truth is we aren't, and neither are you. Again, I think this will change, at least in the United States. I know it's going to change because the vast majority of the American electorate is not interested in this. I once had when I was in the Joint Operations Center at SHAPE headquarters in NATO in 1998 to 2000, I had a Spanish general staff officer who once said to me, you know, Douglas, The United States is not a country. It's a separate planet. Well, he was very right. We tend to live on our own planet, so to say. And as a result, we get things wrong in other places. But the good news is most Americans prefer the planet. They really don't want to involve themselves overseas. So it's always been a problem of how do you get the American people involved? How do you drag them into conflict? That was true in both world wars. It was true in Vietnam, and it's true now. It's not instinctive for Americans to instantaneously press the button for war by any means. I think the other thing is in the Navy, there are really two classes of ships, submarines and targets. And that has been true for a very long time. And I think we have both wasted enormous quantities of money on this vast surface fleet for which there really isn't very much use. Re-examining that is critical and essential because we just can't afford to keep spending vast quantities on these aircraft carriers that, as you say, are increasingly obsolescent. Today, we talk about an aircraft carrier as useful only in permissive environments. Now, stop and think about that. In other words, unless you're trying to invade Borneo, you really can't use the damn thing. Of course, why would you want to invade Borneo? That's another question. I suppose you could use it off the coast of West Africa, but why would we want to do those things? This is a difficult proposition because it's tied up with a lot of money, a lot of jobs, as you know. All of those things come into play. So I think we're very similar in that connection. But the most important thing is national strategy. Salisbury used to say that if it were up to his generals and admirals, they would garrison everything between the planet Earth and the moon on the assumption that there was a threat up there on the moon. I think Salisbury was right. And we have the same problem now. Every time you turn around, new threats are emerging. Anybody who knows anything about China, its long history, knows that this is not a martial culture. This is not a state bent on expansionism. Quite the contrary. China has many problems. We have many problems. There are many things they do we don't like. All of that is true, but there is no real justification for armed conflict with China. And the whole Taiwan business is grossly, grossly blown out of all proportion to reality. First of all, you as British people know damn well how hard it is just to cross 20 or 30 miles of open water. Imagine trying to cross 100 and seize Taiwan. And that, of course, presumes that anybody wants to do it. And why would they? Because they have two parties on Taiwan, one of which is the KMT, and the other is this national party that is really aligned with Japan, and the KMT is aligned with Beijing. Well, I think the KMT is now winning. They just had parliamentary elections. They're roaring back into power because the people in Taiwan don't want a war. And the KMT is an advocate for reunification with China. And I think that'll probably happen on its own. And it's not, we keep depicting China as this evil totalitarian state. What we don't understand is that the model for all Chinese, whether they live in Taiwan or on the continent, is Singapore. They all want to live in something much like Singapore. Well, personally, I would be horrified to live in Singapore, but I'm not Chinese. My culture is different. My way of thinking is different. My historical experience is different, but the Chinese like the Singapore model. If more people understood that, then they would understand why there is no real reason for war with China. Russia is another entirely different animal. But how much do we really know about Russia, let alone Ukraine? I grew up with Ukrainians. I know them well. I love them. They're wonderful people. They have been weaponized by the United States and London to become a threat to Russia. If we had not done that, this war would not currently be underway. The average Ukrainian was not hot to go to war with Russia. People forget that Mr. Zelensky, who was picked by various oligarchs to win the election, actually ran on a platform of a negotiated agreement with Russia to end all further fighting. And he was overwhelmingly elected, even in the western part of Ukraine, where he had very little support, because the Ukrainians weren't interested in this war. So we once again have subverted the natural process, and we brought on this war that is doing enormous damage, not just to Ukraine, but to Europe, and by implication, long-term, to Great Britain and us, all of which is unnecessary. We don't live in 1900. We live in 2022, soon to be 2023. Our commercial interests and Russia's are not that different. So this doesn't have to happen. But again, we have a small, well-financed minority in charge, and no one will admit that this was a terrible mistake. But we're going to see in the next few weeks massive offensives by the Russians to end this war. And it's going to have a terrible impact on Ukraine. I don't know that millions of Ukrainians will ever come home again. And what remains will be wounded for decades. And all of that because we decided we wanted a war with Russia that we were convinced would harm Russia. And ultimately, Russia has not been harmed.
When I was at the Royal College of Defence Studies as a student there, obviously we trained to think strategically as far as possible that we can. Incidentally, can I just ask you something which I find quite amusing? When I was at Sandhurst, we were given a definition of the difference between tactics and strategy. And I think it was attributed to an American general. It might have been Patton. It's a little bit out of date now, but it still tells the story, which I've never found a better way of suggesting it to anybody, a young student, for example. And it's a little bit out of date, but bear with me if you will. It's strategy is how you get a young lady to come to the cinema with you and sit in the back seat. Tactics is what you do when you get her there.
Yeah.
And I've always found that a wonderful way of actually looking at it. Now, the point is with the disappearance of the British Empire, and of course we had the Indian subcontinent, where there was an implication on the northwest frontier, and the great game, of course, in that part of the world between the Russian Empire and the British Empire, all understandable at that time. And eventually, of course, we found ourselves in the war in the Crimea. Funny how that name pops up again, in the Crimean War, which did no good to anybody, which was won by the British and the French, but at vast cost to no real end at all, to support the Ottomans, which was a pretty crazy thing to do anyway. Leaving that aside, I would argue that from a strategic point of view and a strategic perception, that Russia is not a strategic enemy at all, never has been, except when it was Soviet and they were politically hostile and a strong military power. So consequently, you might argue that they weren't a strategic enemy, but they were a political enemy, which hence NATO was formed, of which I was a part, we were both part, which was a purely defensive organization and quite successful in that role. That was quite successful, that was fine. But we couldn't accept, we could not accept when the collapse of the Soviet Union came about, that NATO was totally and utterly obsolete. You don't need NATO. There is no point in NATO because Russia in itself is not a strategic enemy, certainly not to the United States. In fact, of course, it's just strategic to Great Britain. It's a strategic ally, as proved in 1914-18 and again in 1939-1945. They were, without them on the eastern border, the Second World War would not have been won. So they are more of a natural ally. So I don't understand, and this comes back to mainstream media again, not having the talent in mainstream media to actually put ministers on the plot and say, what is your problem with Russia? What is your problem with the Russian Federation? What has it got to do with us? And why do you think that now they are a threat?
Yeah, I would like to hear someone explain that. I haven't heard it here in Washington to my satisfaction. There's always this intention to confuse contemporary Russia, which is an Orthodox Christian state that sits on the foundation of Russian Orthodox Christian culture, with the Soviet Union. This is not the Soviet Union. It does not embrace an ideology of relentless expansion. There is no revolutionary current in the Russian mindset today. Russia simply wants to survive and do business with its neighbors in most cases. I think we've done ourselves a terrible disservice by misrepresenting Russia. And of course, people will say, well, it's autocratic. It's not sufficiently democratic. Well, I could find a lot wrong with our alleged democracy here in the United States. All of our big cities are fraught with corruption. Elections are handled very poorly, have been for decades. The notion that we have free and fair elections is misleading inside these large urban areas. So I guess my problem has always been with the simple truth that if you live in a glass house, you shouldn't throw stones. We are by no means perfect. Why are we insisting that everyone else have to be perfect, or then we treat them as an enemy? This is this sick, demented globalist culture. By the way, that falls in line with your comments on climate change. If you don't accept that climate change is imminent, and if we don't bankrupt ourselves trying to quote unquote stop it, which is absurd, frankly, that somehow or another we are evil and deserve the worst. It's crazy. It's insane. We have become unbalanced in our thinking across the English-speaking world. The least reasonable people I run into today are frankly people from the English-speaking world. They have this fuzzy-headed idea that we are morally superior to everyone else. I guess we've substituted moral superiority for racial superiority. It's all nonsense. I still think it will end, but it's not going to end until the suffering and pain that we are feeling now for reasons to do with bad economic decisions come home to roost. You know, the other thing is that you and we are both maritime and aerospace powers, but primarily maritime powers. We've never been land powers for any length of time. The British made the mistake in 1914 of confusing itself over this, dragged themselves into a war they really didn't need to fight. You know, Bismarck's Germany was another good example. Bismarck chastised the second German Kaiser for sending brand new German naval combatants into the Baltic. And he said, "Why did you do that, Your Majesty?" And of course, the Kaiser's answer was, "Well, I want the Russians to know we're strong." And his answer was, "The only thing you did was remind the Russians of their own weakness. That's the last thing we want to do." And then he moved down the road with the British and the British Navy. He said, "Why are we building this Navy at all? We don't need it." And he said, "Well, you know, we have to be a great power. Britain's a great power. If we don't have a big Navy like Great Britain, we can't be a great power." Said nonsense. We have the greatest land power in the world. Everybody knows that. We don't need a big Navy. There's no sort of rational calculus like this going on in London or Washington. If it did, I guess we'd all be sitting with stacks of cash in our bank accounts and very healthy, prosperous economies, because there's just no reason for conflict and war in Ukraine today against Russia. None, as far as we're concerned. On the other hand, we should all be interested in bringing this to a close. Now we're going to have a absolutely destroyed Ukraine with millions of Ukrainians fleeing that have no place to go. This is going to harm Europe beyond belief. It's incomprehensible that people can't see it. There's nothing noble and glorious about destroying Ukraine, which is what we've done.
I'm glad you just mentioned 1914, because I was interested in your take on that in the first chapter of your book, which I want to come on to in just a moment. The retreat from Mons, of course, which I don't know whether you met Richard Holmes at all, the historian, whether you came across him in your time, a great historian, dead now, sadly, a friend of mine. In 1914, you quite rightly say that we kept out of the Franco-Prussian War. We took no part in the Franco-Prussian War. And basically, this was another Franco-Prussian War, nothing to do with us. And on the anniversary in 1918, I gave a lecture to the London School of Economics on how we could have stayed out of the Great War to the benefit of Europe, all Europe, by staying out as a major economic power in 1914 and a major naval power. If we had stood back, let them sweat it out in the trenches, come to a conclusion in 1916 that nobody was going anywhere, and then broker a peace in London and get everybody around the table, saved millions of lives, saved Europe, saved, incidentally, as I'm sure you'll agree, the Second World War, which wasn't really a Second World War. It was part two of one war. And that wouldn't have happened, and we wouldn't have had Stalin, and we wouldn't have had Hitler, Mussolini, and all the rest of it, all the baggage that came with it. It would have been much better if we'd stayed out and brokered a peace. And that could have been done. And in my lecture, I won't bore you with it, but I have a transcript for anybody watching on my website who'd like to look at it. It's only about 1,500 or 2,000 words or whatever, it doesn't matter. But it shows you how we could have actually done this if we'd had a strategic hat on. And we didn't. We involved ourselves, which brings me back to the other point, which you mention in your book, that Asquith didn't want that. Members of his cabinet didn't want that. Even Lloyd George didn't want war with Germany. But it was drummed up then by the media again. Poor little Belgium, babies being bayoneted by Germans and all this kind of thing. It was drummed up. And modern warfare, when I say modern warfare, I mean modern history warfare, which I would argue go 200 years is modern as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to this kind of thing. That the press actually stoked this up. And they stoked it up. And of course, it cost the British Empire 1 million dead and 2 million maimed. It was, and it broke what I would argue, we'd probably fall out over this. I think the British Empire, broadly speaking, was a force for good in the main. And it could have then developed into a Commonwealth, which it now is, with goodwill and trade all round. But that's perhaps a subject for another day. We didn't have to get involved. It was a terrible, terrible mistake. No good came of it. But it was whipped up by the press, broadly speaking, rather than politically, I would argue. And that's the mistake that was made, of course. And I think that's where we come back to your point about statesmen. We need a statesman to come along and say, you need to have a little think about this. Where would we go? I mean, and Eisenhower, and you mentioned Eisenhower in your trilogy, your recent trilogy, which I thought was excellent. And I've read quite a lot of Eisenhower's work. Wouldn't agree with him necessarily on economic matters per se, but generally speaking, I think the advantage of Eisenhower was that he was a general and knew what war meant. Most people don't understand what war is. Nasty. War is evil. War is a very, very nasty business. And if you can avoid war, it's almost in everybody's interest. Most wars are unnecessary. Most, not all. I'm not a pacifist, but most wars are unnecessary. And I think it's difficult for me to believe that, and I think it was your phrase, I've used the phrase myself as well before I started reading your work, America hasn't won anything since Korea, and Korea was a draw. So why does this go on? And this is where I'd like to just bring you out a little bit, because you've had experience that I haven't had. So because you've been at the White House, you've had top political experience. I've had political experience, but not at your level. Why do people do? I know there's an industrial military complex on this. Why would I have in my country a chief of general staff? Why would I have a man who's managed to get that far? And you make the point, put everybody above the rank of colonels, a politician, political general. You don't get promoted above 1 star unless you're politically expedient. He has said just in the last month or two, don't worry about the Russians. They have rusty rifles and no boots.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, what can I say? Well, 2 things. First of all, we haven't been at war since 1965. We talk about it, but really we weren't at war. In other words, we fought these actions on the cheap. These are what Clausewitz refers to as wars of observation. We call them wars of choice. In other words, whether you wage them or not probably doesn't make much difference in the grand scheme of things. They're not going to change the world strategically, alter the international system. Versus a war of decision, which Clausewitz rightly pointed out, is a war that has existential implications for the nation states that fight it. And of course, he was looking at that against the backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars. And the point is, we haven't had that kind of thought process here in the United States. And Americans have been misled. You know, it's back to clubbing baby seals. Oh, this morning we bombed country X, and they're now in ruins, and they are compelled to accept our demands, this sort of thing. And everybody says, oh, cheers, that's great, wonderful, we've done a great job. It's all nonsense. We're no longer dealing with that when we're confronting Russia. I think that's very obvious now to people. And of course, the nuclear dimension is always there. But at least to this point, it's very clear to me that most of the people that are at the top want nothing to do with a nuclear exchange. I'm talking about the people in Washington. And I know that the Russians absolutely do not want anything to do with a nuclear exchange. So that's good news. The bad news is that we overestimate ourselves in conventional terms. And today, if you sent the United States Army anywhere, it would end up being very much like the British Expeditionary Force in 1914. It would do reasonably well, but it can't win. And unlike the British Expeditionary Force in 1914, we have no ally like the French that put millions of troops into the field. Remember, at the end of that retreat from Mons, the British were controlling something in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 miles of front. That's almost nothing compared to the other 380 miles or 90 miles that the French army controlled. So then you go through this gut-wrenching process of having to conscript, go through a draft. Well, those days are over now. If we get into a scrap with the Russians, it'll look worse than Dunkirk because there's nothing behind us. The German army doesn't even exist for all intents and purposes. The French army is there, but as a friend of mine in the French army said, Douglas, we have 4 to 5 days worth of ammunition. You can't fight a high-end conventional war with that kind of foundation. So it's time to have some strategic thinking. And the key questions are always the same. What is the purpose of what we're doing? Secondly, how do we do it? In other words, what's the method? And 3, what do we want things to look like after this is over? Unfortunately, in both world wars, the attitudes of the leaders in Britain and France, well, we're in this war to destroy Germany. Really? Why? Why do you want to destroy Germany? What do you really want from the Germans? What is Britain getting out of this war? And is it only the destruction of Germany? Because if that's true, that's one of Britain's top trading partners. All the optics that you used in 1914 in the British military and the Royal Navy all came out of Germany. There were all sorts of things, technologies that were critical to British needs that came out of Germany. So why are you intent on destroying Germany? The same thing in World War II. I'm actually a great fan of Corelli Barnett because he's critical of Churchill, who says, you know, we'll fight to the bitter end, blah, blah, blah. We're never surrender. Well, wait a minute. Nobody's asking you to surrender. Have you considered perhaps William Pitt's approach? Maybe it's time to come to some sort of arrangement with your enemy until you're stronger at a future point in time and can re-engage. There was no thinking like that. So Britain was harmed badly in World War I, and it was destroyed in the Second World War. And we stupidly helped to do that. The only people that won the Second World War were the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, who had killed vastly more people than Adolf Hitler ever killed. But nobody ever bothers to bring that up. Nobody ever bothers to understand that what you're dealing with in Germany or Russia or China is different from what you may think. These nations are nations that have been around for a long time. You have to judge them on the basis of history and culture and interests. No one wants to go down that road. Instead, we have people like this German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, who refuses to shake hands with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov from Russia. Why? Because she's morally superior and he's morally inferior in her view? This is childish nonsense. It's absurd. There's no willingness to talk. And right now, I see no hope for a negotiated end in Ukraine. The only end I see coming is the end to Ukraine. And if you're a Russian right now, what are you going to negotiate for? In other words, if we end up with some sort of rump Ukraine, the Russians are going to insist that whatever is still there must be neutral. If it isn't, then they risk going back through another war again that we may cultivate. So there's nothing to discuss. There's no negotiation. And we have no strategic advantage that we are operating from. I haven't seen it. Again, Russia is a continental land power. We are not. Our strengths are at sea and in the air. We are only a land power in the Western Hemisphere. Britain's army has been shrunken to the point where I'm not sure the British could put 30,000 troops into Europe in a short period of time and they'd be effective. The French have already admitted that. So what happens next? No one has thought through this.
Well, of course, I had the pleasure of meeting Corelli Barnett personally some years ago, and I agree with you totally, and I agree with him. It was, sometimes you just have to come to the table to make the best of a very bad job. And we could have.
And your first consideration should always be, if I had been sitting where Churchill was in 1914 in the cabinet or subsequently in World War II, is first and foremost, we must preserve British power. I keep telling people the most important thing we do in the United States is preserve American national power. We're doing nothing to preserve it. We're doing everything to dissipate it, squander it, and destroy it.
Could I ask you, Colonel, we'll wind up on this. I'm very conscious of your time and your generosity of giving it. But it's important that we get your views here in England. Very important. We're not getting this in England. We're not getting it, and we must get it if we're gonna be, because we're already putting our nose in it. We can't seem to keep our nose out of things. Boris Johnson is making mischief at the moment. But what I'd like to just ask you to, finally, just to wind up on, and I do hope that we could have another conversation perhaps in the new year. How do you see, you've just illustrated pretty much what the situation is going to be. How do you see it politically? It's going to be force majeure, isn't it? There's nothing we can do about it. The Russians are going to win. Of course they're going to win. They can't lose. And there'll be warfare always throws out some odd stuff. There'll be some odd things here going on and stuff we didn't expect. But generally speaking, by the spring, it'll be over. How can, when we sit around that table, you're quite right, Ukraine has to be completely neutralized. We cannot have any form of NATO force or NATO missiles anywhere near it. And it's also going to have to perhaps spill over a little bit. What's going to happen with the Poles, what's going to happen with Romania and Moldova, which in their constitution of Moldova say they won't have anybody on their territory at all. There's all sorts of implications, as there always are. But it seems to me, and we'll wind up on this with your final words, Colonel, if we may, who in your senior command, who in today's White House or CIA, which seem to control a lot of the thinking, is going to actually say, right, we've got to accept that we've lost. We have to accept that we've lost. Can they accept that they've lost, or are they going to just kick off another war somewhere else to satisfy the military-industrial complex?
Well, to answer the first question, General Milley, who's not someone I necessarily admire, frankly, I do not, is very much a political animal. But at least a couple of weeks ago, he had the good sense to tell the president in the Oval Office, you know, the Ukrainians have done about all they can do right now. This would be a good time to negotiate. Well, he knew the truth. He knew that the casualties and the loss rate, in other words, killed in action, had risen to 15,000 a month in Ukraine. They're way over 100,000 dead now. And he tried to make that point to President Biden, who apparently was offended and said, absolutely not, as did all of his advisors, his Secretary of State, his National Security Advisor. And the next day, Milley, being who he is, went public and recanted 100%. Oh, no, we're going to stay the course forever. We're going to win, blah, blah, blah. Mr. Burns, who was the former ambassador to the Soviet or the Russian state, Burns is the head of the CIA. I'm sure he knows this to be true, but he too appears to have been willing to prostitute himself to these dumb policies on the grounds that I guess he wants to hold on to his job. I think it's very unfortunate. We just don't seem to have any people with backbone. But then again, if you go back to the Vietnam War by 1968, 69, virtually everyone thought it was a muddled affair. It was going nowhere. There was no chance for any meaningful military victory. No one could define what would happen politically that would be beneficial to us. Yet no one would resign. No one stood up and said, that's it, I'm out. Nobody in uniform. So we have a huge problem with an acute lack of character in our senior ranks. You would have to know more about the British military than I do to determine whether or not that's also the case in Britain. I don't know, but that's a huge problem for us. Now, what happens? What happens is very simple. The Russians will terminate this thing on the terms that suit them. I think that the government in Berlin will be gone by the time this ends. I hope so. Because the Germans have always known from the beginning this was a very stupid idea. And I think the Germans are quite frankly sick of the whole business. The Poles, whom the Germans have tried very, very hard to befriend and work with, are now widely regarded as dangerous lunatics inside Germany. So the Germans are probably going to be the ones that part ways and diverge from the mainstream with us. Maybe Macron, though I doubt it. He's another Soros puppet. I don't see him branching out to change anything, but perhaps the French will ultimately get rid of him eventually. The Italian leadership has already changed. They will send humanitarian assistance, but no military assistance. I think the longer this lasts, the more Europeans will look at this as a catastrophe that needs to end. And since we refuse to end it, this is going to put an end to NATO. I just don't see NATO surviving this event. I said that back in January. I still have serious doubts about it. And that's probably in the grand scheme of things a good thing, because the Europeans need to find their own way. You know, de Gaulle said it well. He said the problem for NATO is the following: Britain is an island, and the United States does not live in Europe. De Gaulle was right. And his point was, you, like the United States, we are both preeminently maritime powers, aerospace powers. We fly in, we fly out. We sail in, we sail out. We are not permanently rooted on the continent. Ergo, the people that live on the continent are going to have to come up with something else. And I think they will, given time. But it's going to be ugly, because there are an awful lot of people who've made an awful lot of money out of this alliance here in Washington and other major capitals, and continue to enrich themselves as a result of this disastrous war.